When the men of Redemption Creek made a cruel wager betting Daniel Crenshaw $500 that he couldn't make the town's fat woman fall in love with him by Christmas, they expected nothing more than cruel entertainment at Eliza Hartwell's expense. But as their fake courtship blossomed into something unexpectedly real in the harsh Arizona territory of 1867, Daniel discovered that the joke was ultimately on him and that true love could grow from the ugliest beginnings. Would he choose the money that could secure his future, or the woman who had already captured his heart? A gunshot cracked through the morning air, sending birds scattering from the giant saguaro cactus that stood like a lonely giant outside Redemption Creek. Eliza Hartwell jumped at the sound, nearly dropping the heavy sack of flour she was carrying into Murphy's General Store. The Arizona Territory in 1867 was no place for weak nerves, but even after 2 years in this dusty settlement, sudden noises still made her heart race like a wild horse. "Just target practice," called out old Pete from his rocking chair on the store's wooden porch. His weathered face crinkled into a smile as he watched her struggle with the flour sack. "That new fellow Daniel's been showing off his shooting skills to the local boys, trying to prove he belongs here, I reckon." Eliza nodded and pushed through the store's creaky door, the brass bell above jingling her arrival. The familiar smells of coffee beans, leather goods, and penny candy greeted her like old friends. She had been working at Murphy's store for nearly a year now, ever since Mr. Murphy's wife took sick and needed help with the daily tasks. The job paid enough for her small room upstairs and 3 meals a day, which was more than many unmarried women could say in this frontier town. Setting the flour sack on the wooden counter with a heavy thud, Eliza wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The August heat was already brutal at 8 in the morning, and by noon it would be hot enough to fry an egg on the store's tin roof. She had learned to do most of her heavy work early, before the sun turned the desert into a furnace that could kill a person if they weren't careful. Through the store's dusty window, she could see the man old Pete had mentioned. Daniel Crenshaw stood near the water trough, reloading his pistol with smooth, practiced movements. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like it had been cut by someone who knew what they were doing. His clothes were cleaner than most men's in Redemption Creek, and his boots still had enough shine to catch the morning sunlight. "He's been asking questions about you," said a voice behind her. Eliza spun around to find Mrs. Carpenter standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes missing nothing as usual. The banker's wife had a way of appearing without warning, like a hawk swooping down on a field mouse. Her silk dress looked out of place in the dusty store, but she wore it like armor against the rough frontier world around her. "Questions about me?" Eliza's voice came out smaller than she intended. In her experience, when men asked questions about her, it usually led to whispered jokes and cruel laughter. Mrs. Carpenter stepped closer, her heels clicking on the wooden floor like the ticking of a clock. "Oh, yes, dear. He wanted to know if you were spoken for, what kind of work you did, whether you had family back east." She paused, studying Eliza's face with the intensity of a cat watching a mousehole. Quite interested, he seemed. Eliza felt her cheeks grow warm. She was 26 years old and had long ago accepted that marriage and romance were not meant for women like her. In St. Louis, where she had grown up, the other girls had been petite and graceful, able to wear the fashionable dresses that made them look like delicate flowers. Eliza had always been different, taller, rounder, taking up more space in a world that seemed designed for smaller people. "I'm sure you're mistaken," Eliza said, turning back to her work. "Men like Mr. Crenshaw don't usually take interest in women like me." "Women like you?" Mrs. Carpenter's voice carried a strange tone, as if she were tasting something bitter. "And what kind of woman do you think you are, Eliza?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Eliza had spent years trying to answer that very question for herself. She knew she was stronger than she looked, able to lift heavy boxes and work long hours without complaint. She knew she was smarter than many people gave her credit for, having read every book in the store's small collection twice. She knew she was kinder than this harsh place sometimes deserved, always ready to help a neighbor in need or tend to a sick child. But she also knew what she saw when she looked in the mirror each morning. She saw a woman whose dresses had to be let out instead of taken in, whose face was pretty enough, but came attached to a body that didn't fit the picture most men carried in their heads when they thought about wives and sweethearts. "I suppose I'm the kind of woman who works hard and minds her own business," Eliza finally answered. Mrs. Carpenter laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, my dear girl, you have no idea what kind of woman you really are, do you?" She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the brass handle. "Perhaps Mr. Crenshaw will help you figure that out." After Mrs. Carpenter left, Eliza tried to focus on her morning tasks, but her mind kept wandering to the conversation. Why would a man like Daniel Crenshaw ask questions about her? And why did Mrs. Carpenter seem so interested in his curiosity? In Redemption Creek, information was as valuable as gold or water, and people rarely shared either without expecting something in return. She was arranging canned goods on the shelf when the bell above the door chimed again. This time, it was Martha Henderson, the preacher's wife, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Morning, Eliza," Martha said, her voice warm as fresh-baked bread. "I brought some of my apple turnovers for the store. Mr. Murphy always liked them, and I thought they might bring in a few extra customers." Martha was one of the few people in town who treated Eliza with genuine kindness. She was a small woman with graying hair and gentle hands that seemed to heal whatever they touched. Her husband might deliver the sermons on Sunday, but Martha was the one who lived them every day of the week. "That's very thoughtful," Eliza said, accepting the basket. The smell of cinnamon and apples made her mouth water. "I'm sure they'll sell quickly." "I hope so. We could use the extra money." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Between you and me, some folks have been a bit slow with their donations lately. Times are hard for everyone, I suppose." Eliza nodded. She had seen the signs around town. Fewer customers at the store. More families asking for credit. Men talking in worried voices about cattle prices and railroad delays. The frontier was always a struggle, but lately it felt like the struggle was winning. "Martha," Eliza said, hesitating before continuing, "have you heard anything about the new man in town, Daniel Crenshaw?" Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "A little. He's been staying at the boarding house, paying his bills on time. Claims to be looking for investment opportunities, maybe starting a business of some kind." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Why do you ask?" "Mrs. Carpenter mentioned that he'd been asking questions about me. It seems unlikely." Martha studied Eliza's face with the same careful attention she gave to her sick patients. "Eliza, honey, you sell yourself short. You're a fine woman with a good heart and a strong back. Any man would be lucky to have your attention." The words were kind, but Eliza had heard similar reassurances before. They never changed the reality of her situation or the way men's eyes slid past her when they walked into the store. "Besides," Martha continued, "maybe it's time you stopped assuming what men think and started finding out for yourself." The sound of breaking glass shattered the afternoon quiet, followed by a string of curse words that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. Eliza rushed from behind the store counter to find Daniel Crenshaw standing in a puddle of pickle juice, surrounded by the scattered remains of what had been a perfectly good jar of Mrs. Kowalski's famous dill pickles. "I am so sorry," Daniel said, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I was reaching for the coffee beans on the top shelf and somehow managed to knock this down instead." He gestured helplessly at the mess, his fine clothes now decorated with pickle juice and broken glass. "Don't worry about it," Eliza said, grabbing a mop and bucket from behind the counter. "Happens more often than you'd think. Last week, Mayor Hutchins knocked over 3 jars of honey trying to reach the tobacco." Daniel watched as she began cleaning up the mess with quick, efficient movements. "At least let me pay for the damage. And please, let me help clean this up." "No need," Eliza replied, not looking up from her work. "The floor's seen worse than pickle juice, believe me." But Daniel had already found a rag and was kneeling beside her, carefully picking up the larger pieces of glass. This close, Eliza could smell his cologne, something expensive and citrusy that reminded her of the fancy department stores in St. Louis. His hands were clean and soft, not like the calloused, dirt-stained hands of most men in Redemption Creek. "You must think I'm a complete fool," Daniel said, depositing a handful of glass shards into the bucket. City fellow who can't even buy pickles without causing a disaster. I think you're a man who made an honest mistake, Eliza replied. Besides, if I judged every customer by their worst moment in the store, I'd have run everyone out of town by now. Daniel laughed, and the sound was rich and genuine. I suppose that's one way to look at it. He paused in his cleaning, studying her face. You know, I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Daniel Crenshaw. Eliza Hartwell, she replied, suddenly very aware of how she must look, hair escaping from its pins, dress stained with pickle juice, kneeling on the floor of a general store. Not exactly the picture of feminine grace her mother had tried so hard to teach her back in St. Louis. Miss Hartwell, Daniel repeated, as if testing how her name sounded in his mouth. That's a lovely name. Are you from around here originally? St. Louis, Eliza said, wringing out the mop. Came out here with my aunt 2 years ago after my mother passed. She died of fever last winter, so now it's just me. The words came out matter-of-factly, but Daniel caught the slight tremor in her voice. I'm sorry for your loss. It must be difficult, being on your own in a place like this. Eliza shrugged, standing up and smoothing down her skirts. This place is what you make of it. Some folks see nothing but dust and hardship. Others see opportunity and freedom. And which do you see? The question caught her off guard. Most people didn't ask for her opinions about anything more complicated than the weather or the price of flour. I see home, she said finally. It took me a while to recognize it, but that's what this is now. Daniel stood as well, brushing dust from his knees. That's a beautiful way to put it. I'm still figuring out what I see here. What brought you to Redemption Creek? Eliza asked, genuinely curious. Men like Daniel, educated, well-dressed, clearly from money, didn't usually end up in dusty frontier towns unless they were running from something or toward something equally compelling. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, like a cloud passing over the sun. Business opportunities, mostly. The railroad's coming through eventually, and smart investors can make good money if they get in early. He paused, then added, plus, I needed a fresh start. Sometimes a man has to leave his past behind to find his future. There was something in his voice that suggested the past he'd left behind hadn't been entirely pleasant, but Eliza knew better than to push. Everyone in Redemption Creek had their secrets, their reasons for choosing this hard life over whatever they'd known before. Well, she said, if you need any advice about local business opportunities, Mr. Murphy knows just about everything that goes on in this territory. He'll be back from Tucson next week. I appreciate that. In the meantime, maybe you could help me with something else. Daniel's voice carried a note of nervousness that hadn't been there before. I was wondering if you might join me for a walk this evening. Nothing fancy. Just a chance to see more of the town and maybe continue our conversation. Eliza felt her heart skip like a stone across water. She had imagined this moment countless times, a handsome man asking for her company. But in her dreams, she had always been different. Smaller, prettier, more like the women who graced the covers of the magazines that sometimes made their way to the store. That's very kind of you to ask, she began, her mind racing through all the reasons this couldn't be real. But I'm sure you have other, more suitable companions to choose from. More suitable? Daniel's brow furrowed. I'm not sure what you mean. Eliza gestured vaguely at herself, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, surely there are other ladies in town who would be better company for someone like you. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Miss Hartwell, may I speak plainly? She nodded, though part of her dreaded what he might say. In the 10 minutes I've spent talking with you, I've learned more about kindness, wisdom, and strength than I have in months of conversations with other people. You handled my clumsy accident with grace. You've shown genuine interest in my circumstances without being nosy, and you've spoken about this town and your life here with a depth of feeling that's refreshing. He stepped closer, and Eliza caught another whiff of that expensive cologne. So when I ask you to take a walk with me, it's not charity or pity or any other unworthy motive. It's because I genuinely enjoy your company and would like to know you better. The words were pretty, almost too pretty. A small voice in the back of Eliza's mind whispered warnings about smooth-talking men and their hidden motives. But a larger part of her, the part that had been lonely for longer than she cared to admit, wanted desperately to believe him. "All right," she heard herself saying. "I close the store at 6. We could walk then, if you'd like." Daniel's smile was bright enough to light up the whole store. "Excellent. I'll meet you right here at 6 o'clock sharp." After he left, Eliza stood in the middle of the now clean store, trying to process what had just happened. She had been asked on what could only be described as a social outing by the most eligible bachelor to arrive in Redemption Creek in years. It felt like a dream, the kind she used to have as a young girl before life taught her to be more realistic about her prospects. The afternoon seemed to drag by with unusual slowness. Every customer who entered the store seemed to take forever to make their purchases, and Eliza found herself glancing at the clock on the wall with increasing frequency. She tried to focus on her usual tasks: organizing inventory, sweeping floors, updating the account books, but her mind kept wandering to the upcoming evening. What would they talk about? Where would they walk? Most importantly, what would she wear? Her wardrobe was limited and practical, designed for work rather than social occasions. She had one dress that might be considered suitable for calling, a deep green cotton with small white flowers that her aunt had helped her make the previous spring. At 5:30, she flipped the closed sign on the store's front door and hurried upstairs to her small room. The space was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a single window that looked out over Main Street. She had made it as comfortable as possible, with a few personal touches: her mother's quilt on the bed, a collection of books on a makeshift shelf, and a small mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. Looking at herself in that mirror now, Eliza tried to see what Daniel might have seen when he looked at her. Her hair was a warm auburn color that caught the light prettily when it wasn't escaping from its pins. Her eyes were a clear gray-green, and her complexion was healthy despite the harsh desert sun. She was taller than most women and, yes, larger than most men seemed to prefer, but she carried herself with dignity. Maybe, she thought as she changed into the green dress, maybe that was enough. The rattlesnake's warning buzz froze Daniel mid-step, his hand instinctively reaching for Eliza's arm as they walked along the dusty path behind the church. The deadly serpent coiled between two rocks not 3 feet ahead, its diamond-patterned back gleaming in the evening light like a beautiful, lethal jewel. "Don't move," Eliza whispered, her voice steady despite the danger. "He's just as scared as we are." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Eliza slowly reach down and pick up a small stone. With careful, deliberate movements, she tossed it to the left of the snake, creating a soft thud in the desert sand. The rattler immediately slithered toward the sound and disappeared into a crack between the rocks. "How did you know to do that?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky with relief. "You learn things living out here," Eliza replied, brushing dust from her green dress. "Snakes don't want to fight any more than we do. They just need a reason to leave." They continued walking, but Daniel found himself studying his companion with new eyes. Back in San Francisco, the ladies he had courted would have fainted at the sight of a snake, requiring smelling salts and a comfortable chair for recovery. Eliza had handled the dangerous situation with calm intelligence, probably saving both their lives. "You're full of surprises, Miss Hartwell," he said as they reached the old oak tree at the edge of town. The massive tree provided blessed shade, and someone had built a simple wooden bench beneath its branches. "Most people don't bother to look for surprises in someone like me," Eliza said, settling onto the bench with a soft rustle of skirts. Daniel sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Someone like you? You keep saying that. What exactly do you mean?" Eliza was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. The sky had turned the color of ripe peaches, and the first evening stars were beginning to appear. A cool breeze stirred the oak's leaves, bringing relief from the day's heat. "I mean someone who doesn't fit the usual picture," she said finally. "When men think about the kind of woman they want to court, they picture someone small and delicate, someone who needs protecting and can't handle a rattlesnake on her own." Daniel turned to face her more fully. And you think that's what I want? Isn't it what all men want? The question hung between them like morning mist. Daniel found himself thinking about his life in San Francisco, about Margaret Thornton with her tiny waist and helpless fluttering whenever faced with any difficulty. He had been engaged to Margaret for 6 months, and in all that time, he couldn't remember a single conversation that had challenged his thinking or made him see the world differently. I thought it was, he admitted. Back in California, I was engaged to a woman who couldn't open a jar of preserves without help. She was considered the perfect lady. Beautiful, accomplished, from a good family. What happened to her? Eliza asked, though her tone suggested she might already guess. She married my business partner 3 weeks after I lost everything. Daniel's voice carried old pain but no anger. Turns out perfect ladies need perfect situations. When mine fell apart, so did our engagement. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its lonesome call echoing across the desert. The sound reminded them both of how far they were from the civilized world, how dependent they were on their own strength and the kindness of neighbors. I'm sorry, Eliza said softly. That must have been difficult. It was the best thing that could have happened to me, Daniel replied, surprising himself with the honesty. If she had stayed, I never would have come west. I never would have learned what I was really made of, and I never would have met someone who could face down a rattlesnake and then act like it was nothing special. Eliza felt warmth spread through her chest like honey in hot tea. She had spent so many years believing that her size, her independence, her practical nature made her undesirable. Having someone appreciate those very qualities felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. Tell me about San Francisco, she said, partly to change the subject, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know more about this man who had appeared in her life like an unexpected gift. Daniel leaned back against the tree trunk, his expression growing distant. It's a wild place, probably wilder than here in some ways. Gold brought every kind of person you can imagine. Honest folks looking for a new start, criminals running from their past, dreamers chasing impossible fortunes. And which were you? A little of all three, I suppose. Daniel's laugh was rueful. I went there to practice law, convinced I could make my fortune representing miners and merchants. Instead, I got caught up in land speculation and lost everything I had. Is that why you came to Arizona? Daniel nodded. A man I knew in the legal business told me the railroad would be coming through this territory eventually. Said smart investors could buy land cheap now and sell it dear later. I scraped together enough money for travel expenses and a few months' room and board. And if the railroad doesn't come, then I'll find another way to make a living. Maybe open a law practice here. Help folks with land disputes and business contracts. He paused, studying her face in the growing twilight. What about you? Do you plan to work in the store forever? The question touched on dreams Eliza rarely allowed herself to consider. I'd like to have my own business someday. Maybe a boarding house or a restaurant. There aren't many places for travelers to get a decent meal in this territory. That's a fine ambition. You certainly have the skills for it. You think so? The hope in her voice was carefully controlled, as if she were afraid to want something too much. I know so. You handled every customer who came into the store today with patience and fairness. You know how to manage inventory, keep books, deal with suppliers. Most importantly, you understand people. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the desert. Stars appeared one by one, more brilliant than either of them had ever seen in their former homes. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and the moon hung low and orange on the horizon. I should get you home, Daniel said reluctantly. It's not proper for a lady to be out too late. I suppose not, Eliza agreed, though she was reluctant to end this perfect evening. As they walked back toward town, their conversation turned to lighter topics. Books they had read, places they had seen, funny stories from their pasts. Daniel told her about the time he had accidentally worn mismatched shoes to court, winning his case partly because the judge was so amused. Eliza shared the story of her first week in Redemption Creek, when she had mistaken a tumbleweed for a small bear and screamed loud enough to bring half the town running. I'd like to do this again, Daniel said as they reached the store's front door. "Would you consider joining me for supper tomorrow evening? There's supposed to be a decent restaurant near the hotel." "I'd like that very much," Eliza replied, then hesitated. "Daniel, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why me?" The question came out in a rush, as if she had been holding it back all evening. "I mean, there are other unmarried ladies in town, prettier ones, from better families." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes even in the dim light from the store's window. "Because, when I talk to you, I feel like I'm talking to a real person, not a character in a play. Because you're brave and kind and smart, and you don't pretend to be helpless when you're actually strong." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like the best version of myself instead of just another disappointment." The words hit Eliza like a physical force, filling spaces in her heart she hadn't realized were empty. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make another person feel better about themselves, let alone someone like Daniel who seemed to have everything together. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke louder. "Thank you for giving me a chance," Daniel replied. "I'll see you tomorrow evening at 6? 6 o'clock, Eliza confirmed. The shouting from Henderson's saloon could be heard 3 blocks away, loud enough to wake the dead and certainly loud enough to interrupt Eliza's afternoon inventory count. She set down her pencil and walked to the store's front window, where she could see a crowd gathering in the dusty street outside the saloon's batwing doors. "Fight! Fight!" someone yelled, and more men came running from various directions like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Eliza's stomach clenched with worry. In the 3 days since her first walk with Daniel, their evening conversations had become the brightest part of her days. The thought that he might be involved in whatever trouble was brewing at the saloon made her feel sick with anxiety. She was about to step outside for a better look when Martha Henderson burst through the store's door, her usually calm face flushed with excitement and concern. "Eliza, you need to come quickly," Martha panted, still catching her breath from running. "It's about Daniel." The words hit Eliza like a punch to the stomach. "Is he hurt? What's happened?" "He's not hurt, but he might be soon if someone doesn't talk sense into those men." Martha grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her toward the door. "They're saying terrible things about him, about you, about both of you together." As they hurried down Main Street, Martha explained what she had overheard. Jake Morrison, who spent more time drunk than sober, had been holding court at the saloon, telling anyone who would listen that Daniel Crenshaw was making a fool of himself, chasing after the fat lady from the store. He said no real man would court you unless he was getting paid for it. Martha continued, her voice tight with anger. Then Charlie Stevens joined in, saying maybe Daniel had a bet going with someone back in California. Eliza felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but underneath the embarrassment was a growing flame of anger. She had known this day would come, the day when Redemption Creek's gossips would turn their attention to her newfound happiness and try to destroy it with cruel speculation. By the time they reached the saloon, the crowd had grown to include most of the town's men and a good number of the women. Through the gaps between bodies, Eliza could see Daniel standing near the bar, his face dark with fury. Jake Morrison swayed drunkenly nearby, still talking loudly about bets and jokes and how some men would do anything for money. "You take that back," Daniel's voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. "Take back what you said about Miss Hartwell, or I'll make you take it back." Jake laughed, the sound ugly and full of malice. "Oh, the fancy gentleman's got his feelings hurt. Maybe you should tell us all how much they're paying you to pretend that Cow is pretty." The crowd went dead silent. Even the saloon's piano player stopped his endless rendition of "Oh Susanna" to listen. Eliza felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep and leave scars. Daniel's fist connected with Jake's jaw before anyone could react. The drunk man went down hard, his head hitting the floor with a sickening thud. But instead of staying down, Jake rolled over and pulled a knife from his boot, the blade gleaming wickedly in the saloon's lamplight. "Now you've done it," Jake snarled, blood running from his split lip. Nobody hits Jake Morrison and walks away. The crowd pressed backward, giving the 2 men room to fight. Several people called for the sheriff, but everyone knew he was out of town dealing with cattle rustlers. In frontier justice, this would have to play out on its own terms. Daniel raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "Put the knife away, Morrison. This doesn't have to go any further." "Oh, but it does," Jake replied, circling slowly like a wolf stalking prey. "You think you can come to our town, act all high and mighty, make fools of us with your fancy clothes and big words? Time someone taught you how things work around here." From her position at the edge of the crowd, Eliza watched in horror as Jake lunged forward with the knife. Daniel dodged to the side, but the blade caught his sleeve, tearing through the fabric and drawing a line of blood along his forearm. "Stop this!" Eliza shouted, pushing through the crowd despite Martha's attempts to hold her back. "Stop it right now!" Both men turned to look at her, and the entire saloon fell silent again. Eliza stood in the doorway, her chest heaving with emotion, her gray-green eyes blazing with a fire that made even Jake Morrison take a step backward. "This is about me," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "If you have something to say about me, Jake Morrison, then say it to my face instead of hiding behind your whiskey and your knife." "Eliza, no," Daniel started forward, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I can fight my own battles," she said firmly. Then she turned back to Jake, who was still holding the knife but looking uncertain for the first time since the confrontation began. "You want to know why Daniel Crenshaw spends time with me?" Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's because I'm worth spending time with. Because I'm smart and kind and capable of having a real conversation about something other than cattle and card games and who's sleeping with whose wife." A few of the women in the crowd murmured agreement, and Eliza felt a surge of confidence. "You think I don't know what people say about me? You think I don't hear the whispers and the jokes?" She took another step into the room, and several men moved aside to give her space. "I've heard them all, Jake, but here's what you don't understand. I don't care what small-minded people think about my size or my appearance." She gestured toward Daniel, who was still bleeding from the knife wound, but watching her with obvious admiration. "This man sees something in me that's worth his time and attention. If that threatens you so much that you feel the need to pull a knife, then maybe the problem isn't with him or with me." Jake's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. Being lectured by a woman in front of the entire town was more humiliation than his pride could handle. He raised the knife again, but this time his target was Eliza. "You think you're so smart, so much better than everyone else?" he snarled. "Let's see how smart you are with steel in your belly." But before Jake could take another step, Daniel moved with surprising speed for someone who had just been cut. He grabbed a heavy beer mug from the nearest table and brought it down on Jake's wrist with enough force to make the drunk man drop the knife with a howl of pain. "The lady said her piece," Daniel announced to the room, his voice deadly calm. "Anyone else want to discuss Miss Hartwell's personal business, they can discuss it with me first." He looked around the saloon, making eye contact with every man present. Most of them suddenly found their boots very interesting to look at. Sheriff Patterson chose that moment to return from his cattle rustling investigation, pushing through the crowd with his usual air of weary authority. He took in the scene, Jake Morrison on the floor holding his wrist, Daniel bleeding from a knife wound, Eliza standing in the middle of it all like an avenging angel, and sighed deeply. "I can't leave this town alone for 5 minutes," he muttered. "Somebody want to tell me what happened here." As various people began talking at once, each giving their version of events, Eliza quietly moved to Daniel's side to examine his wounded arm. The cut wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily and would need cleaning and bandaging. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish," she whispered to him. "Which part?" Daniel asked with a slight smile despite the pain. "All of it." Eliza tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and began wrapping his arm. "But thank you for defending my honor." "Thank you for defending yourself," Daniel replied. "That was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." As the sheriff sorted out the trouble and the crowd began to disperse, Eliza realized something important had changed. She had stood up for herself in public, spoken her truth without apology, and discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. More importantly, she had seen the way Daniel looked at her during her speech, not with pity or charity, but with genuine respect and admiration. Maybe, she thought as they walked back toward the store together, maybe she was worth fighting for after all. Blood dripped steadily onto the letter Daniel was trying to write, each red drop spreading across the white paper like accusations he couldn't answer. His wounded arm throbbed with every heartbeat, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the guilt eating at his conscience as he sat alone in his boarding house room, 3 days after the saloon fight. The letter was addressed to his brother in San Francisco, asking for money to cover his mounting debts in Redemption Creek. What he couldn't bring himself to write was the truth about why he needed it, that he had made a foolish wager about winning a woman's heart, and now found himself genuinely in love with the very person he was supposed to be deceiving. A soft knock at his door interrupted his tormented thoughts. "Mr. Crenshaw, you have a visitor." Daniel quickly hid the blood-stained letter under some business papers and opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, standing with a worried expression. "There's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you. Says he's come all the way from California on urgent business." Daniel's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. Only one person from California would travel this far to find him, and that visit could only mean trouble. Downstairs in the boarding house parlor, a familiar figure waited with the patience of a man accustomed to getting his way. Thomas Brennan was Daniel's former business partner, the same man who had married Daniel's ex-fiancée and taken over his legal practice when everything collapsed. He was shorter than Daniel, with thinning hair and the soft build of someone who spent his days behind a desk, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a born predator. "Danny boy," Brennan said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "you're looking well for a man who owes me $3,000. "Thomas," Daniel's voice was carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting you." "I'll bet you weren't. Took me considerable effort to track you down to this charming little settlement." Brennan's gaze swept around the modest parlor with obvious disdain. "We need to talk. Privately." They stepped out onto the boarding house porch, where the afternoon heat hit them like walking into an oven. Daniel's wounded arm ached in the dry air, and sweat immediately began beading on his forehead. "You haven't answered my letters," Brennan continued, pulling out a silk handkerchief to dab at his face. "The interest on your debt keeps growing, and my patience keeps shrinking. I told you I'd pay when I could. The railroad investments take time to develop." Brennan laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Railroad investments? Is that what you're calling your little romantic adventure with the local shopkeeper?" Daniel felt ice form in his veins despite the desert heat. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come now, Danny. Did you really think word wouldn't get back to me? I have business interests in every major territory. When Daniel Crenshaw starts courting some fat woman in a nowhere town, people talk." The casual cruelty in Brennan's voice made Daniel's hands clench into fists. "Don't talk about her that way." "Ah, so it's true then. The great Daniel Crenshaw has fallen for his own con game." Brennan's smile widened. "That's rich. Almost worth the trip just to see it. What do you want, Thomas?" "What I've always wanted, my money. But since you clearly don't have it, I'm prepared to make you an alternative offer." Brennan reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "There's $1,000 in here, enough to clear part of your debt and give you traveling money back to civilization." Daniel stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "What's the catch?" "You leave town today, without a word to anyone, especially your shopkeeper friend. Let her figure out on her own that you never cared about her." "No." The word came out harder than Daniel intended. "No?" Brennan's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "That's not very smart, Danny. See, if you don't take this generous offer, I might have to start telling people around town about your real reasons for being here. About certain wagers that were made back in San Francisco regarding your romantic prospects." Daniel felt the world tilt around him. "You know about the bet?" "I know everything, my friend, including the fact that you were supposed to prove you could make any woman fall in love with you, even a desperate spinster in the middle of nowhere. Quite the amusing challenge, really." The truth hit Daniel like a physical blow. The wager hadn't been made by the men in Redemption Creek. It had been part of his past, a drunken boast he had made months ago in a San Francisco saloon, trying to prove his worth after losing everything. Brennan had clearly kept track of it, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as leverage. The difference is, Brennan continued, back home it was just talk between drunk men. Here, it would destroy that poor woman's reputation completely. Imagine how the good people of Redemption Creek would react to learning their local romance was nothing but a cruel game from the beginning. It's not a game anymore, Daniel said quietly. Maybe not for you, but what do you think Miss Hartwell will believe when the truth comes out? That you really fell in love, or that you're just a very good actor? Daniel looked across the street toward Murphy's General Store, where he could see Eliza through the window, helping a customer with patient kindness. The sight of her made his chest ache with a pain deeper than any physical wound. $1,000, Brennan repeated, holding out the envelope. Leave town today, and this whole embarrassing episode disappears. Stay, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are. And if I take the money, you get a fresh start somewhere else. Your debt gets reduced. The woman keeps her dignity. Brennan's voice took on a reasonable tone, as if he were offering a fair business deal. Everyone wins. Daniel stared at the envelope, knowing that taking it would be the smart thing to do. It would solve his financial problems, get Brennan out of his life, and protect Eliza from the humiliation of learning the truth about how their relationship began. But it would also mean abandoning the first real happiness he had ever known and leaving behind the woman who had shown him what love could actually feel like. I need time to think, Daniel said finally. You have until tomorrow morning. I'm staying at the hotel tonight, and I'll be on the morning stage either way, with or without you. Brennan tucked the envelope back into his jacket. Choose wisely, Danny. Some chances don't come twice. The desert wind howled like a living thing outside Eliza's small room, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds rolling down Main Street like ghostly messengers of trouble to come. She had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering why Daniel had seemed so distant during their walk that evening. Something was wrong. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed when he thought she wasn't looking, hear it in the pauses between his words when they talked. After 3 weeks of growing closer, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, and tonight he had been carrying worry like a heavy pack. A soft tapping at her door made her sit up in bed, her heart racing. No one came calling at midnight unless there was serious trouble. Miss Hartwell? The voice belonged to young Tommy Patterson, the boarding house owner's son. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but there's something you need to know. Eliza quickly wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and opened the door. Tommy stood in the hallway, his 12-year-old face serious beyond his years. What's wrong? She asked. It's about Mr. Crenshaw. There's a man staying at our house. Came in on today's stage from California. I heard him talking to Mr. Crenshaw on the porch this afternoon, and I think you should know what he said. Eliza felt her stomach clench with dread. What kind of things? Tommy glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then stepped closer. The man said something about Mr. Crenshaw owing him money. And he mentioned you by name. Called you. The boy's face reddened. He said mean things about you, ma'am. Things that made Mr. Crenshaw real angry. What else did you hear? The California man offered Mr. Crenshaw money to leave town. Said if he didn't go, he'd tell everyone in Redemption Creek some kind of secret about why Mr. Crenshaw was really courting you. The words hit Eliza like bullets, each one finding its mark with deadly precision. She had always known, deep in her heart, that Daniel's interest in her was too good to be true. Men like him simply didn't court women like her without some hidden reason. Did you hear what the secret was? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Tommy shook his head. No, ma'am, but Mr. Crenshaw looked like he'd seen a ghost when the man mentioned it. After Tommy left, Eliza sat on her narrow bed and tried to make sense of what she'd learned. Daniel owed money to someone in California. That same person was threatening to reveal some damaging secret about Daniel's reasons for courting her, and money had been offered to make Daniel leave town quietly. The logical conclusion was obvious and heartbreaking. Their entire relationship had been built on some kind of deception, probably involving money or a wager. She had been played for a fool by a smooth-talking stranger who saw her loneliness as an opportunity. But even as her mind accepted this bitter truth, her heart rebelled against it. The way Daniel looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the genuine warmth in his voice when they talked about their dreams, the way he had defended her honor in the saloon, none of it felt like acting. Unless he was a much better actor than she had given him credit for. The next morning dawned gray and cold, unusual weather for the Arizona territory that seemed to match Eliza's mood. She went through her morning routine mechanically, washing, dressing, pinning up her hair, while trying to decide what to do with the knowledge Tommy had given her. She could confront Daniel directly, but if he was truly deceiving her, he would probably just lie about it. She could wait and see if he left town with the mysterious stranger, but that would leave her wondering forever about what might have been real between them. Or she could take control of the situation herself. By the time she opened the store for business, Eliza had made her decision. She would give Daniel a chance to tell her the truth, and his response would determine how their story ended. The morning passed slowly, with fewer customers than usual. Word of the confrontation in the saloon had spread through town, and some people seemed to be avoiding the store to avoid awkward conversations. Others came in specifically to stare at her and whisper among themselves. Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Carpenter arrived wearing her usual expression of smug superiority. She browsed the fabric selection for several minutes before approaching the counter where Eliza was working on the account books. "My dear," Mrs. Carpenter said in the tone she used when delivering particularly juicy gossip, "I heard the most interesting thing at the hotel this morning." Eliza kept her eyes on her ledger. "Oh? There's a gentleman staying there who claims to know Mr. Crenshaw from California. Apparently they were business partners at one time." Mrs. Carpenter paused, clearly waiting for a reaction. "He's been asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual things. How long you've been in town, what your circumstances are, whether you have any family." Mrs. Carpenter's voice took on a false sweetness that made Eliza's teeth ache. "He seemed particularly interested in your relationship with Mr. Crenshaw." Eliza finally looked up from her books. "I'm sure he was just being polite." "Perhaps. Or perhaps he was trying to determine if certain rumors he'd heard were true." Mrs. Carpenter leaned across the counter, her eyes bright with malicious pleasure. Rumors about wagers and bets and young men trying to prove points about their romantic abilities. The words confirmed Eliza's worst fears, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I don't pay attention to rumors, Mrs. Carpenter." "How very wise of you. Though sometimes rumors turn out to be true, don't they?" Mrs. Carpenter straightened up, clearly disappointed by Eliza's lack of reaction. "I just thought you should know what people are saying." After Mrs. Carpenter left, Eliza closed the store early and walked to the hotel. If she was going to learn the truth, she might as well hear it from the source. The California stranger was easy to spot in the hotel's small lobby. His expensive clothes and soft appearance marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign. He was reading a newspaper when Eliza approached, and looked up with mild curiosity when she stopped beside his chair. "Mr. Brennan, I presume?" she said, pleased that her voice remained steady. "I'm afraid you have the advantage, miss, though I suspect I know who you are." "Eliza Hartwell. I understand you've been asking questions about me." Brennan folded his newspaper and studied her with calculating eyes. "Sit down, Miss Hartwell. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." The teacup shattered against the hotel room wall, sending china fragments flying like deadly snowflakes, as Eliza's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. Thomas Brennan had just finished explaining the original wager from San Francisco, how Daniel had drunkenly boasted he could make any woman fall in love with him, even a desperate spinster in the middle of nowhere. "You're lying," Eliza said, though her voice lacked conviction. The pieces fit together too perfectly, explaining Daniel's sudden interest, his knowledge of exactly what to say to win her trust. "I wish I were," Brennan replied, brushing china dust from his expensive suit. "Daniel owes me a considerable sum of money. When I heard he was out here playing Romeo to the local shopkeeper, I knew I had found my leverage." Eliza sank into the room's only chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The humiliation was complete. Not only had she been deceived, but the deception had been planned from the beginning. Every sweet word, every gentle touch, every moment of connection had been calculated to win a bet she hadn't even known existed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want Daniel to leave town with me tomorrow, and he's being foolishly sentimental about it." Brennan straightened his tie, his movements precise and cold. "I thought perhaps if you knew the truth you might help convince him that staying would be unwise." Through the hotel window, Eliza could see Daniel walking toward the building, his shoulders set with the determination of a man who had made a difficult decision. Her heart lurched with a mixture of longing and betrayal that made her feel physically sick. "He's coming," she whispered. "Perfect timing," Brennan said. "Now you can hear it from his own lips." Daniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, each one bringing him closer to a confrontation that would destroy whatever remained of Eliza's faith in him. When he knocked on the door, she seriously considered hiding, but pride forced her to remain seated. "Come in," Brennan called out. Daniel entered the room and stopped short when he saw Eliza. His face went pale, and she could see the exact moment he realized his secret was out. The guilt in his eyes was answer enough, but Brennan wasn't finished with his cruelty. "Miss Hartwell came to hear about your little wager," Brennan said pleasantly. "I was just explaining how you bet you could seduce any woman, no matter how desperate or unattractive." "Eliza, please let me explain." Daniel started forward, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's silence stretched for what felt like hours. When he finally spoke, his words came out broken and raw. "The bet was made months ago, when I was drunk and angry and trying to prove I wasn't the failure everyone said I was. But Eliza, what happened between us?" "Was it true?" she repeated, louder this time. "Yes," Daniel said, the word dropping like a stone into still water. "The original wager was real, but everything that came after—" Eliza stood up so quickly that the chair tipped over behind her. "Everything that came after was built on a lie. Every conversation, every walk, every moment I thought we were getting to know each other, it was all part of your game." "It stopped being a game the first night we talked," Daniel said desperately. "The moment you told me about facing down that rattlesnake, the moment you showed me what real strength looked like, I forgot all about the stupid bet." "But you never forgot about the money you owed," Brennan interjected smoothly. "Which is why you're going to pack your things and come back to San Francisco with me. We have a morning stage to catch." Daniel turned to face his former partner, his expression hardening. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Thomas, and I'm not leaving Eliza." "Oh, but you are." Brennan pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "See, I've been asking around town about your lady friend here. Turns out she's been sending money back east every month to an orphanage in St. Louis where she grew up." Eliza's face went white. Her small charitable donations were private, something she did to help children who had grown up as unwanted as she had. The fact that Brennan had discovered and investigated this felt like a violation of her most sacred space. "That's right," Brennan continued, seeing her reaction. "A very touching story. Really, the fat girl who grew up unwanted, now trying to help other unwanted children. I wonder how those children would feel if they knew their donations were coming from the victim of such a cruel joke." "You bastard!" Daniel stepped toward Brennan, his fists clenched. "Careful, Danny. Violence won't solve this problem." Brennan's voice remained calm, but his eyes held a warning. "I could make Miss Hartwell's private business very public. Imagine the headlines in the territorial newspapers. Cruel wager targets charitable spinster. The story would follow her everywhere she went." Eliza felt the walls closing in around her. Not only had she been made a fool of, but now her private charitable work was being used as a weapon against her. The children she helped would suffer if this story became public scandal. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Simple. Daniel comes back to California with me, and this whole embarrassing episode disappears forever. No public revelations, no newspaper stories. No one ever needs to know that your romance was anything other than a tragic case of a man who couldn't commit." Daniel looked between Eliza and Brennan, his face a mask of anguish. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Eliza said quietly. "He's right. If this story gets out, it will hurt people who don't deserve it." She walked to the window and stared out at the desert landscape that had become her home. In the distance, She could see the old oak tree where she and Daniel had shared their first real conversation. The memory felt like a physical wound now, knowing it had all been part of his performance. "I won't let him destroy you," Daniel said, moving to stand beside her. "I'll find the money somewhere else. You'll what?" Eliza turned to face him, her eyes dry but filled with a pain that cut deeper than tears. "You'll keep lying to me? Keep pretending that what we had was real?" "It was real," Daniel insisted. "I know it started as a lie, but it became real. I love you, Eliza. That's not part of any game." The words she had longed to hear now felt like mockery. "How can I believe anything you say? How do I know this isn't just another part of your performance?" "Because I'm willing to give up everything to prove it," Daniel said. "I'll stay here and face whatever consequences come. I'll work to pay back every penny I owe, even if it takes the rest of my life. No." Eliza's voice was firm, final. "You'll go back to California with Mr. Brennan. You'll pay your debts and start over somewhere else. And you'll never contact me again." "Eliza, promise me," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "Promise me, you'll go and never come back." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. He could stay and fight, but that would mean public humiliation for both of them and potential harm to the children she supported. He could keep arguing, but she had already made her decision. "I promise," he said finally, his voice breaking on the words. Brennan smiled triumphantly. "Excellent. We leave on tomorrow's stage. I'll give you time to pack and say your goodbyes." As Daniel left the room without another word, Eliza remained by the window, watching his retreating figure disappear into the gathering dusk. She had just saved herself from further humiliation and protected the children she helped, but the victory felt hollow as dried bones. The morning stage rumbled into Redemption Creek like thunder across the desert, its wheels kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything like a fine coating of regret. Eliza stood at her bedroom window, watching as Daniel loaded his belongings onto the coach with mechanical precision, his movements careful and controlled. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face when he promised to leave, heard the break in his voice when he said goodbye. Part of her wanted to run downstairs and beg him to stay, to find some way to make their impossible situation work. But the larger part of her, the practical part that had learned to survive disappointment, knew that some things were too broken to fix. Martha Henderson appeared at her door without knocking, carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits that Eliza couldn't possibly eat. "You need to see this," Martha said, setting the tray aside and pulling a letter from her apron pocket. "Daniel asked me to give it to you after the stage left." Eliza took the letter with trembling hands. Her name was written on the envelope in Daniel's careful script, but she couldn't bring herself to break the seal. Whatever he had written would only make this harder than it already was. "There's something else," Martha continued. "That man from California, Brennan, he's been spreading stories around town, ugly stories about you and Daniel." Eliza's heart sank. What kind of stories? "He's telling people that Daniel was paid to court you, that it was all a joke from the beginning." Martha's voice was tight with anger. "He's making it sound like you were in on it, like you were desperate enough to pay a man for attention." The cruelty of it took Eliza's breath away. Even in victory, Brennan couldn't resist twisting the knife. She had agreed to let Daniel go to prevent exactly this kind of public humiliation, but he was spreading lies anyway. "What are people saying?" she asked. "Some believe it, some don't. But the damage is being done." Martha sat down heavily on the bed. "I'm so sorry, Eliza. I tried to tell people the truth, but you know how gossip spreads in a small town." Through the window, Eliza could see Daniel speaking intently with the stage driver, his hands moving in urgent gestures. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe he was changing his mind. Maybe he would stay and fight for her after all. But then Brennan appeared, said something sharp to Daniel, and the conversation ended. Daniel climbed into the coach without looking back toward the store, and Eliza felt the last of her hope die. The stage pulled away in a cloud of dust, and the sound of harness leather creaking. Eliza watched until it disappeared around the bend in the road, taking with it the first man who had ever made her feel beautiful. "Read the letter," Martha said gently. Whatever he wrote, you deserve to know. With shaking hands, Eliza broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Daniel's handwriting was hurried, as if he had written it in desperate haste. My dearest Eliza, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will think you know the whole truth about why I came to Redemption Creek. But there is more to the story than Thomas Brennan told you, and you deserve to hear it all. The wager was real. In a moment of drunken stupidity, I boasted that I could make any woman fall in love with me. But what Thomas didn't tell you is that I never intended to follow through on it. I came to Arizona to escape my past, not to prove some cruel point. When I started spending time with you, it wasn't because of any bet. It was because you were kind to a clumsy stranger who knocked over your pickles. It was because you had the courage to face down a rattlesnake and the wisdom to know that fear and respect could coexist. It was because, when I talked to you, I felt like myself for the first time in years. I know you won't believe me now, and I don't blame you. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid of losing the only good thing that had ever happened to me. I was a coward, and my cowardice has cost us both dearly. Thomas is threatening to destroy your reputation and hurt the children you help in St. Louis. I can't let that happen, so I'm leaving, as you asked me to do. But I want you to know that what we had was real, at least for me. Every moment, every conversation, every touch, it was all real. I've left something for you with Martha. Use it however you see fit. And please, don't let Thomas Brennan's cruelty make you doubt your own worth. You are the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and any man who can't see that is a fool. I will love you until the day I die, whether you believe me or not. Yours always, Daniel. Eliza read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Then she looked up at Martha, who was watching her with concerned eyes. He left something for me? Martha nodded and pulled another envelope from her apron, this one thick with what felt like money. He said it was everything he had left, plus some he borrowed against future earnings. Said you'd know what to do with it. Eliza opened the envelope and found nearly $800 in banknotes, along with a deed to a small piece of land just outside town. There was also a note in Daniel's handwriting. For the boarding house you dreamed of, build something beautiful. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that Eliza felt tears threatening for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Even while leaving her, even while facing his own financial ruin, Daniel had thought of her dreams. What will you do? Martha asked. Eliza looked out the window again, toward the road where the stage had disappeared. Then she looked at the money in her hands, at the deed to land that could become the foundation of a new life. I'm going to prove that I'm worth more than their cruel games, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm going to build something beautiful, just like he said. And I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows that Eliza Hartwell is nobody's victim. She stood up, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into her dress pocket. The pain of Daniel's betrayal was still there, sharp and fresh, but underneath it was something new, a fierce determination to prove that she was stronger than their lies. First, though, I need to have a conversation with the people of Redemption Creek. It's time they heard the truth about what really happened here. Martha smiled, recognizing the steel in her friend's voice. What do you need me to do? Help me gather everyone at the church tonight. Tell them Eliza Hartwell has something important to say. Eliza moved to her mirror and began pinning up her hair with quick, efficient movements. It's time I stopped letting other people tell my story. The church bell rang 13 times instead of the usual 12, its extra chime echoing across Redemption Creek like a call to judgment. Eliza had asked Reverend Henderson to add the extra ring, a signal that tonight's gathering was different from any Sunday service the town had ever seen. People began arriving as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, their faces curious and wary. Word had spread quickly that Eliza Hartwell wanted to address the entire community about the rumors surrounding her and Daniel Crenshaw. Some came out of genuine concern, others drawn by the promise of drama and gossip. Mrs. Carpenter arrived early, dressed in her finest black silk as if attending a funeral. She chose a seat in the front row where she could watch Eliza's face closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Behind her sat Jake Morrison, recently returned from a week of hiding his shame after the saloon incident, his jaw still slightly swollen from Daniel's punch. Sheriff Patterson took his usual place near the back door, ready to maintain order if emotions ran too high. Martha Henderson bustled around lighting extra lanterns, while her husband prepared to moderate whatever confession or confrontation was about to unfold. As the church filled with curious townspeople, Eliza stood in the small room behind the altar, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. She had chosen her best dress, the deep blue silk that Daniel had complimented on their first evening walk, and pinned her auburn hair back severely. Tonight, she would speak her truth with dignity, regardless of how the town chose to receive it. "They're ready for you?" Reverend Henderson said softly, appearing in the doorway. "Are you certain you want to do this? Once words are spoken in public, they can't be taken back." "I'm certain," Eliza replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts. "I've spent too many years letting other people define who I am. Tonight, I define myself." She walked into the main church to find nearly every seat filled. Faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, some suspicious, others openly curious about what scandal might be revealed. The weight of their collective attention pressed down on her like the desert heat, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet their gazes directly. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "I asked you here tonight because there are stories being told about me, and I believe you deserve to hear the truth." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not how they had expected her to begin, with composure rather than tears, with directness rather than pleading. "Some of you have heard that my relationship with Daniel Crenshaw was based on a wager, that he was paid to court me, to make me believe he cared about me." Eliza paused, letting the words settle over the room like dust. "Those stories are partially true." The murmur grew louder. Mrs. Carpenter leaned forward in her seat, clearly anticipating a dramatic breakdown that would provide weeks of gossip material. Daniel Crenshaw did come to Redemption Creek carrying the burden of a foolish bet made in a moment of drunken pride. But what grew between us had nothing to do with any wager. Eliza's voice grew stronger, more confident. What grew between us was real, built on genuine respect and affection. "How can you be sure?" called out Charlie Stevens from the middle of the church. "How do you know he wasn't just a good actor?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eliza had asked herself the same thing countless times since learning the truth. Her answer came from the deepest part of her heart, the part that had recognized something true in Daniel's eyes even when her mind told her to be cautious. "Because I know the difference between performance and authenticity," she replied. "I've seen enough false kindness in my life to recognize the real thing when it appears." She began to pace slowly across the front of the church, her movements measured and deliberate. "You want to know what convinced me Daniel's feelings were genuine? It wasn't his pretty words or romantic gestures. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. It was the way he defended my honor when drunk men spoke crudely about me. It was the way he listened when I talked about my dreams and took them seriously." "But he lied to you," Mrs. Carpenter interjected, her voice sharp with accusation. "He deceived you from the very beginning." "Yes, he did," Eliza agreed, stopping to face the banker's wife directly. "And that lie hurt me deeply. But let me ask you something, Mrs. Carpenter. Have you never told a lie to protect someone you cared about? Have you never kept a secret because revealing it would cause more harm than good?" Mrs. Carpenter's face flushed, and she looked away. Others in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own moments of less than perfect honesty. "Daniel made a mistake," Eliza continued. "A serious mistake that cost us both dearly. But the mistake was in not trusting me with the truth, not in his feelings for me. So, why didn't he stay and fight for you?" This question came from Martha Henderson, asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Eliza smiled sadly. "Because he loved me enough to protect me from the consequences of his past mistakes. Thomas Brennan threatened to destroy my reputation publicly, to hurt the children I helped support back in St. Louis. Daniel chose to sacrifice his own happiness rather than let that happen." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the thick envelope of money Daniel had left behind. Before he left, he gave me this. Nearly everything he had in the world, plus money he borrowed against future earnings. He asked me to use it to build the boarding house I dreamed of. The crowd stirred with surprise. This detail had not been part of Brennan's gossip campaign. Now, I could take this money and leave Redemption Creek. Start over somewhere else where nobody knows my story, Eliza said, holding up the envelope. Or I could use it to prove something to all of you and to myself. She walked to the church's collection box and dropped the entire envelope inside with a decisive thud. Gasps echoed through the room. I'm donating this money to build a proper school for Redemption Creek's children, she announced. Not because I need to buy your respect or forgiveness, but because this community deserves better than gossip and cruelty. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of wind whistling around the church's wooden walls. I am not a victim, Eliza declared, her voice ringing with conviction. I am not a fool who was tricked by a smooth-talking stranger. I am a woman who took a chance on love, who fought for what she believed in, and who refuses to be defined by other people's small-minded judgments. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of as many people as possible. Some of you will choose to remember this story as a cautionary tale about trusting outsiders. Others might see it as proof that people like me should know our place and not reach for things beyond our station. Her voice softened, but lost none of its strength. I hope some of you will remember it as the story of a woman who learned that her worth doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion, including her own doubts. As she prepared to leave the church, Jake Morrison stood up suddenly. Wait, he called out, his voice hoarse with emotion. I got something to say. The crowd turned to look at the man who had caused so much trouble in the saloon, whose cruel words had started the chain of events that led to this public reckoning. Miss Hartwell, Jake said, his eyes fixed on the floor, I owe you an apology. What I said about you, the way I talked, it wasn't right. You're a good woman, and you deserved better from all of us. Eliza studied his face, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. Thank you, Jake. That means more than you know. One by one, other members of the community began to stand. Not all of them, Mrs. Carpenter remained firmly seated, her face a mask of disapproval, but enough to show that Eliza's words had found their mark. We'll help build that school, called out Tom Mueller, the town's carpenter. No charge for the labor. I'll donate supplies, added Sarah Morrison, Jake's wife, shooting her husband a meaningful look. As promises of support filled the air, Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. The pain of losing Daniel was still there, sharp and fresh, but alongside it was something new, a fierce pride in her own strength, and the knowledge that she had faced her worst moment with dignity intact. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter rang out from the new Redemption Creek Schoolhouse, a sturdy building that stood as proof of what a community could accomplish when it chose cooperation over gossip. Eliza stood in the doorway watching Miss Caroline Porter, the young teacher they had hired from back east, lead her students through their morning lessons. The building was everything Eliza had hoped for when she donated Daniel's money. Spacious, well-lit, with proper desks and a library filled with books donated by families throughout the territory. More importantly, it had become a symbol of second chances and the power of choosing kindness over cruelty. Miss Eliza, called out little Jenny Patterson, Tommy's younger sister, will you tell us a story today? After your arithmetic lesson, Eliza promised, smiling at the eager faces turned toward her. She had become a regular visitor to the school, sharing stories and helping with reading lessons when Miss Porter needed an extra pair of hands. As she walked back toward Murphy's store, which she now managed completely since Mr. Murphy's retirement, Eliza reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible night at the church. The money Daniel had left, combined with community donations, had been enough to build the school and establish a small fund for ongoing expenses. More surprisingly, his gesture had inspired others to contribute to various town improvements. The boarding house Daniel had envisioned for her remained a dream, but it was a dream she was working toward with her own earnings rather than relying on someone else's sacrifice. She had learned the difference between accepting help and becoming dependent on it. Miss Hartwell, Sheriff Patterson's voice called out from across the street. Got a telegram for you from back east. Eliza's heart jumped. The only people who would send her telegrams were connected to the St. Louis orphanage where she continued to send monthly donations. She hoped there wasn't trouble with the children. But when she opened the yellow paper, the message was entirely unexpected. Daniel Crenshaw, stop, paid full debt to Brennan, stop working railroad construction, Colorado, stop, asks permission, write to you, stop, advise response, stop, J. Hamilton, Western Union. Eliza read the telegram 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel had paid his debts and was working honest labor in Colorado. Most importantly, he was asking permission to contact her rather than simply writing without warning. The fact that he had respected her request for no contact while working to make himself worthy of renewed correspondence showed a maturity that impressed her. But it also forced her to confront feelings she had spent 6 months trying to resolve. Did she want to hear from him? The practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to protect itself from disappointment, whispered warnings about reopening old wounds. But her heart, which had never quite stopped hoping, beat faster at the possibility of learning how he was faring. Bad news? Sheriff Patterson asked, noticing her expression. I'm not sure yet, Eliza replied honestly. I need to think about it. She spent the rest of the day distracted, going through the motions of running the store while her mind wrestled with the decision. Customers noticed her preoccupation, but she deflected their questions with polite smiles and quick changes of subject. That evening, she walked to the oak tree where she and Daniel had shared their first real conversation. The tree had grown new leaves since then, and someone had carved initials in the bark, not hers and Daniel's, but those of young couples who had found their own romance in Redemption Creek. Sitting on the familiar bench, Eliza pulled out paper and pen to compose her response. She wrote several drafts, each one different in tone and content. Some were cold and formal, others warm but cautious. One was angry, demanding explanations and apologies. Another was forgiving, almost welcoming. In the end, she chose simplicity. Permission granted. Stop 1 letter. Only stop. Explain your circumstances and intentions. Stop no promises or expectations. Stop E. Hartwell. The response felt right, neither encouraging false hope nor closing the door completely. If Daniel had truly changed, if he had learned from his mistakes and become the man she had glimpsed beneath his deceptions, then 1 letter would reveal it. If not, she would know she had made the right choice in moving on. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived with Daniel's familiar handwriting. Eliza carried it unopened for 3 days, sometimes taking it out to look at but never breaking the seal. The weight of it suggested he had much to say, but she wanted to be in the right frame of mind to hear it. Finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the store was closed and the town was resting, she sat down in her small room above Murphy's and opened Daniel's letter. Dear Eliza, I hardly know where to begin, except to say that not a day has passed since I left Redemption Creek that I haven't thought of you and regretted the pain my deception caused. You asked about my circumstances. I am working for the Denver-Rio Grande Railroad, helping to lay track through the Colorado mountains. The work is hard and dangerous, but it pays well and has given me time to think about the man I want to be versus the man I was. I have paid my debt to Thomas Brennan in full, plus interest for his trouble. More importantly, I have paid debts to myself, debts of honesty, integrity, and self-respect that had been accumulating for years. I no longer gamble, drink to excess, or make promises I cannot keep. You asked about my intentions. I would be lying if I said I didn't hope for the possibility of redemption, both in your eyes and my own. But I also understand that some things cannot be undone, and trust, once broken, may never be fully repaired. If you are willing, I would like to correspond with you occasionally, not as a suitor seeking forgiveness, but as a friend who owes you an honest accounting of his attempts to become worthy of the good opinion you once held. I have enclosed something that belongs to you. I hope you will accept it as partial payment on a debt that can never be fully settled. Eliza looked in the envelope and found a smaller package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a simple gold locket, obviously not expensive but chosen with care. When she opened it, she found a small photograph of the Redemption Creek schoolhouse on one side, and, on the other, an inscription, "For the woman who showed me what courage looks like." The gift was thoughtful without being presumptuous, meaningful without being romantic. It suggested that Daniel had indeed learned the difference between empty gestures and authentic appreciation. Sitting at her small writing desk, Eliza began composing her response. This time, the words came easily, flowing from a heart that had found its own strength and was no longer afraid of showing kindness to someone who had hurt her. Dear Daniel, your letter arrived at precisely the right moment, not too soon, when wounds were still fresh, but not so late that healing had closed off all possibility of renewed friendship. I am glad to hear you have found honest work and made peace with your debts. More importantly, I am glad you have found peace with yourself. That was always the real challenge, wasn't it? You may write to me occasionally, with this understanding. I am no longer the woman who needed someone else's validation to feel worthy. I have learned to value myself, and I expect that same self-respect from anyone who wishes to remain in my life. The locket is beautiful and deeply appreciated. I wear it as a reminder not of what we lost, but of what we both learned about resilience and redemption. Your friend, Eliza. As she sealed the letter, Eliza realized that the pain of Daniel's betrayal had finally transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a mature understanding that people could change, grow, and become worthy of second chances. Whether their correspondence would lead to anything more than friendship remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, Eliza was curious about the future, rather than simply enduring it. And that, she thought as she walked to the post office in the gathering twilight, was perhaps the greatest gift of all. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Eliza's attention as she hung laundry behind Murphy's store, growing larger and more urgent with each passing moment, until she could make out a lone rider pushing his horse hard across the desert toward Redemption Creek. The sight made her stomach clench with worry. In frontier towns, desperate riders usually brought desperate news. The horse and rider thundered down Main Street, kicking up a cloud that sent chickens scattering and made people step out of doorways to see what emergency was unfolding. The rider pulled up sharply in front of the sheriff's office, his mount lathered with sweat and breathing hard from the punishing ride. "Sheriff Patterson," the man called out, his voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. "Got urgent news from Colorado Territory." Eliza dropped the wet shirt she was holding and moved closer, her heart hammering with sudden fear. Colorado Territory, where Daniel was working on the railroad. The timing felt too coincidental to ignore. Sheriff Patterson emerged from his office, taking one look at the rider's condition and the state of his horse. "What's the emergency, son?" "Railroad accident up near Georgetown," the rider panted, accepting a dipper of water from Mrs. Patterson. "Cave-in at the tunnel site. Multiple casualties. They're asking for any doctors or medical supplies from surrounding territories." The words hit Eliza like physical blows. Daniel was working railroad construction in Colorado. Georgetown was one of the major sites for the Denver-Rio Grande line. The math was simple and terrifying. "How bad was it?" Sheriff Patterson asked. "Bad. Real bad. At least 15 men trapped. Maybe more. They've been digging for 2 days straight, but..." The rider shook his head grimly. "Some of those boys ain't coming out alive." Eliza felt the world tilt around her. For the past 8 months, she and Daniel had exchanged letters regularly, their correspondence growing from cautious friendship back toward something deeper and more honest than their original relationship. His latest letter, received just 3 days ago, had mentioned working on a particularly challenging tunnel section near Georgetown. "I need to go," she heard herself saying. The words coming out before her mind had fully processed the decision. Everyone turned to look at her, Sheriff Patterson, the writer, several townspeople who had gathered to hear the news. "Go where?" Martha Henderson asked, appearing at Eliza's side with concern written across her face. "Colorado, to the railroad site." Eliza's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I have medical training. I helped Dr. Morrison before he retired. They'll need every pair of hands they can get." "Eliza, that's a 3-day ride through dangerous country." Sheriff Patterson said gently. Even if you could make the journey safely, you don't know if Daniel was even involved in the accident. But Eliza was already moving, her mind racing through practical considerations. She would need supplies, transportation, someone to watch the store. Most importantly, she would need the courage to face whatever she might find at the end of the journey. I have to try, she said simply. If it were your wife trapped under that mountain, wouldn't you want to go? The question silenced the crowd. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew the story of Eliza and Daniel's complicated romance, how it had ended in heartbreak and slowly rebuilt itself through careful correspondence. What many didn't fully understand was how deep their renewed connection had grown. I'll go with you, Martha Henderson announced, surprising everyone, including herself. You'll need someone to help with medical care, and I'm not letting you make that journey alone. Martha, you can't, Reverend Henderson started to protest, but his wife cut him off with a look. Those are human beings trapped under tons of rock and dirt, Martha said firmly. If we can help, we have a Christian duty to try. Within 2 hours, a remarkable transformation had taken place in Redemption Creek. Word of the railroad disaster had spread through town, and the community had rallied with the same spirit they had shown when building the schoolhouse. Tom Mueller donated a sturdy wagon and his 2 best horses. Dr. Morrison, despite his retirement, contributed his entire stock of medical supplies and hastily written instructions for treating various injuries. Mrs. Kowalski packed enough food for a week's journey, while Sheriff Patterson organized an escort of 3 armed men to see the women safely to Colorado. Even Mrs. Carpenter, who had never fully forgiven Eliza for her public speech at the church, contributed $20 toward travel expenses. I may not approve of your romantic choices, she said stiffly as she handed over the money, but I respect your courage. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat beside Martha. Behind them, their supplies were loaded and secured. Ahead lay 3 days of hard travel through country, where rattlesnakes, mountain lions, and desperate men posed constant threats. You sure about this? Sheriff Patterson asked one final time. Eliza thought about Daniel's latest letter, which she had read so many times she could recite it from memory. He had written about the beauty of the Colorado mountains, the satisfaction of honest work, and his growing hope that someday he might be worthy of her forgiveness. He had also mentioned the dangers of railroad construction, the constant risk that came with blasting through solid rock. I'm sure, she said, taking up the reins with steady hands. As their wagon rolled out of Redemption Creek under the first stars, Eliza felt a strange mixture of fear and purpose. She might be riding toward heartbreak. Daniel could already be dead, crushed under tons of rock and earth. Or she might be riding toward redemption, toward the chance to save the man who had taught her the difference between loving someone and needing them. Either way, she was no longer the woman who waited for others to determine her fate. She was the woman who took action when action was needed, who faced her fears instead of hiding from them. The desert night was cold and filled with the sounds of wild creatures, but Eliza felt warmer than she had in months. For the first time since Daniel had left Redemption Creek, she was moving toward him instead of away, and that made all the difference in the world. The Georgetown mining camp looked like a battlefield when Eliza and Martha arrived, their wagon wheels crunching over broken rock and discarded equipment scattered around the tunnel entrance like the bones of some giant beast. Dozens of men worked frantically with shovels and pickaxes, their faces black with coal dust and streaked with sweat despite the mountain's crisp October air. Over here, called out a man who appeared to be in charge, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. You, the medical help from Arizona? Eliza jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, her legs stiff from 3 days of hard travel but her mind sharp with purpose. The scene before her was worse than she had imagined. Makeshift shelters, housing injured men, piles of debris that seemed impossibly large, and the gaping mouth of the collapsed tunnel that had swallowed 15 workers whole. I'm Eliza Hartwell. This is Martha Henderson, she said, grabbing her medical bag from the wagon. We're here to help however we can. The foreman, a grizzled man named Thompson, looked skeptical at first. two women from a small desert town hardly seemed like the answer to his prayers. But when Eliza immediately knelt beside a man with a badly crushed leg and began examining the wound with professional competence, his expression changed to grateful relief. "We've got 6 men pulled out so far," Thompson explained as Martha began unpacking supplies. 3 of them are in bad shape, broken bones, cuts. One fellow might have internal injuries. The rest. He gestured toward the tunnel entrance where the digging continued. "Been 4 days now. Time's running out." Eliza worked quickly to assess the injured men, her training with Dr. Morrison serving her well despite the primitive conditions. She set a broken arm, stitched a deep gash, and administered pain relief to a man whose ribs had been crushed by falling timber. But with each patient she treated, her eyes kept drifting toward the list of names posted near the tunnel entrance, the roll of missing workers. Daniel Crenshaw was the 7th name on the list. "You know one of the trapped men?" Thompson asked, noticing her repeated glances at the roster. "Maybe," Eliza replied, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she said more. As the sun reached its peak, a shout went up from the tunnel entrance. "We've got movement! Someone's responding!" The entire camp rushed toward the opening, where rescue workers had been digging a narrow shaft through the debris. A man with his ear pressed to a long metal pipe called out for silence, then shouted instructions down into the darkness. "Can you hear me down there? Tap once for yes, twice for no." The answering taps came faintly but clearly through the pipe. 1, 2, 3. 3 survivors, still alive after 4 days in the collapsed tunnel. "How many of you are hurt?" the rescuer called down. 4 taps came back, meaning 1 was injured. "Can you move toward the sound of my voice?" 2 taps. "No." The rescue leader turned to Thompson with a grim expression. "They're alive, but someone's hurt bad enough that they can't move. We'll have to dig down to them, and that's going to take at least another day." "A day they might not have," Thompson muttered, but he turned back to organizing the dig with renewed energy. As night fell over the mountain camp, Eliza found herself sitting beside the tunnel entrance, listening to the steady rhythm of shovels and pickaxes cutting through rock and timber. Martha had convinced her to eat some soup and rest for a few minutes, but she couldn't bring herself to move far from the rescue site. "You should get some sleep," said a voice beside her. A young man with bandaged hands sat down on the rocky ground, one of the workers she had treated earlier. "I can't sleep knowing they're down there," Eliza replied. "You know one of them, don't you? I could tell from the way you kept looking at that list." Eliza nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Daniel Crenshaw," the young man continued. "Good man. Worked harder than anyone, never complained, always ready to help when someone needed it. If anyone could survive down there, it'd be him." The words were meant as comfort, but they made Eliza's chest tight with emotion. The Daniel she had known in Redemption Creek had been charming and educated, but she had never seen him do truly hard physical labor. The fact that he had earned the respect of these tough railroad workers suggested he had indeed changed during their months apart. "Tell me about him," she said. "What was he like here?" "Quiet, mostly. Kept to himself except when work required talking. But he was fair in his dealings, never tried to cheat anyone or take more than his share." The young man paused, studying Eliza's face in the firelight. "He got letters regular, like from someone back in Arizona. Always made him smile when they came." Eliza felt tears, threatened for the first time since arriving at the camp. To know that her letters had brought Daniel happiness, that their renewed friendship had meant as much to him as it had to her, filled her with a bittersweet mixture of joy and fear. "He's lucky to have someone who'd travel this far for him," the young man added. "We're friends," Eliza said, though the word felt inadequate for the complex emotions churning in her heart. "Must be some friendship." Just then, another shout erupted from the tunnel entrance. "We're through! We've got an opening!" The entire camp surged forward as the first rescuer disappeared into the narrow shaft they had carved through the debris. Minutes passed like hours until his voice echoed back up the tunnel. 3 men down here. All alive. Need medical help fast." Eliza was moving before Thompson could assign anyone to the task, grabbing her medical bag and heading for the tunnel entrance. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person, dark as midnight. and filled with the constant threat of further collapse. "Ma'am, you can't go down there," Thompson protested. "It's too dangerous." "I'm the only medical help you've got, and those men need treatment now," Eliza replied, already lowering herself into the opening. "Send down supplies as I call for them." The descent was terrifying. A narrow tube through unstable debris with only a rope to guide her way down. But when she finally reached the bottom and saw 3 dirt-covered figures huddled in a small air pocket, all fear disappeared. One of them was Daniel. He was unconscious, his left leg clearly broken and his face pale from loss of blood. But he was breathing, and when Eliza knelt beside him and touched his face, his eyes fluttered open. "Eliza?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from days without water. "Are you real, or am I dying?" "You're not dying," she said firmly, already examining his injuries. "Not if I have anything to say about it." As she worked to stabilize Daniel and the other 2 survivors, Eliza realized that all her doubts about their relationship had crystallized into perfect clarity. She loved this man, not the charming stranger who had deceived her in Redemption Creek, but the person he had become through struggle and honest work. She loved him enough to risk her life in a collapsing tunnel, enough to forgive past mistakes, enough to build a future on the foundation of who they both were now, rather than who they had been. "I thought I'd never see you again," Daniel whispered as she bandaged his wounds. "I'm here," Eliza replied, her voice steady and sure. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Above them, rescue workers prepared to haul the survivors to safety. Below, in the darkness of the collapsed tunnel, 2 people who had lost and found each other discovered that love, like rescue, sometimes required digging through the debris of past mistakes to reach something worth saving.